Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Bob Unger Show. And today we've got a return guest. So that means people were screaming encore, encore, bravo, encore. And so he's going to be an opera star and get an encore. Um, David writes a blog that is called the Great Recession Blog, correct?
Yes.
And tell our viewers a little bit about it.
Okay, it's at thegreatrecession.info. And I started writing the blog because I was really upset with the quality of financial reporting and reporting on the economy that I thought was always missing the mark. They never would see a recession coming, even when they were standing in the middle of it. And so I decided to start writing on the subject. I've been writing on it ever since the Great Recession hit.
And how far back does it go?
I started it, I think, in 2012. So towards the end of the Great Recession, I started writing. I mean, the official end. I started writing on the subject back when things first went down, and that was via newspapers and stuff. And then eventually started my blog.
And this so-called end of the Great Recession, do you buy it?
No, I don't. That's why I called it the Great Recession blog, because as far as I'm concerned, we're still in it. We're just, we basically, the Federal Reserve put out a huge safety net that kept everything up so prices didn't deflate and stuff as much as they were going to. But as soon as those safety nets failed, I said we'd fall right back into an even greater pit and get to feel what the Great Recession was really all about. And in the process, we were only digging the hole so much deeper by creating all this debt. You can't solve a debt problem by stacking up a whole lot more debt. So, no, I think we're still in it.
And I understand that you're a humble guy, but name a few of the calls that you made, and let's see if you were correct.
Okay, well, in 2018 in particular, I said that the market was going to go down, and I said this about probably halfway through 2017. So just taking the most current stuff, I said the market was going to take a hard drop in January, and it did. It was, by some measures, a record plunge. And then I said it was going to go down really hard in the fall of 2018. And this would all be due to the Federal Reserve's tightening. I said the Federal Reserve believes it can tighten, and it's going to find out it can't reduce its balance sheet. And but it's not going to figure it out soon enough. So it's going to try tightening, and the tightening is going to cause the stock market to crash. And of course it did. It took a big jump down in January, and then in 2018 it went over a cliff, as we all know, and it kept going over until the Fed said, okay, we're going to stop tightening, we promise we're going to stop. And everybody took a breath and things settled out. And I said, but okay, damage has been done. So when we get to late 2019, I said we're going to have a huge repo crisis, and we're going to have a recession that starts then that nobody's going to see or acknowledge. But I'll be pointing out along the way how you can see it forming, how it's happening. I said they won't see it or officially acknowledge it until early 2020. And then it'll be obvious by then. I said, but it's going to start out with a huge repo crisis, most likely. And so in the summer of 2019, we saw that the manufacturing went into a recession. And by the fall of 2017, we saw that the services sector, which is the other big part of the economy, was going into recession. And of course, we had the huge repo crisis, which I said would happen because the Federal Reserve's tightening was pulling down bank balances and their reserves too far, and we're going to get into a liquidity problem where banks would start tightening up on what they're willing to do and money they're willing to loan each other. And sure enough, that's where we were. And then when the Federal Reserve said, well, we're going to fix this by doing, our own little repos on the side and to the tune of $100 billion, I said, no, that's not going to be something where they fix it in a few days by doing a few of these things. They're going to have to keep doing it and keep doing it and doing it bigger. And what we're really talking about is it's just more quantitative easing. It's just re-expanding their balance sheet. Because if you do what they call these overnight repos, which is the bank makes a loan to another bank overnight, basically, to keep it simple. And they keep doing that same loan over and over every night. Well, it's no longer an overnight repo. It's, a 3 month or 6 month or however long you keep rolling it over. And I said, they're going to have to keep getting bigger and bigger with this. And they did, until eventually they started doing more quantitative easing outright, but claiming they weren't. And I said, oh, eventually they're going to have to claim they are. And of course, by 2020, they claimed they are, and they just went for it.
Okay, well, you just defined the repo problem for us, but go back to 2018 and define the term you use, quantitative tightening, and then go forward to now and define quantitative easing.
Okay, so quantitative tightening was the Federal Reserve had created a lot of money, and I'm trying to think of how to say it in simple ways. It created a lot of money into the financial system, and quantitative tightening was they're going to start sucking that money back out of the financial system. So they had a method for doing that, and without going into all the details of it, I pointed out along the way that their method of doing that is taking down the reserves of banks that they've been inflating for a long time, telling us that doing this is what's making the banks stable for the next big crash. And they're sucking down those bank reserves because the banks are getting forced into holding on more and more government treasuries and other bonds. And so bank reserves went down as much as the Federal Reserve's tightening took their balance sheet down. So at some point, I said, this is going to get to the point where it's going to become a crisis. And that's where it became a repo crisis in the fall of 2019. The worst repo crisis we've ever had. And the Fed had to quickly start pumping its balance sheet back up. So that's back to quantitative easing. It's now easing the financial system, but putting more money into it. So banks are more prone to make loans to each other, et cetera. So the Federal Reserve started putting money back in long before COVID-19 hit. You can't say, well, this is just a COVID-19 crisis. There's no doubt that adds to it, in a big way. But the Federal Reserve had to pump, $1 trillion in before COVID-19 even hit. And then it just kept going up with more and more. And that gave it the excuse it needed, as well as greater need to do it. So it no longer had to pretend it wasn't doing it. Until COVID-19 hit, it kept saying, well, we're not really doing quantitative easing because we're only buying short-term government bonds, and we don't call it quantitative easing unless we buy long-term government bonds with this money that we create. Well, who cares? That's, semantics. You're doing it long-term, whether the bonds you're buying are long-term or not. So you're just going to keep rolling them over so it's long-term.
And now you claim that this is not the greatest economy in the history of the entire world.
Yeah.
As our illustrious president is claiming, the greatest economy ever, beyond anything ever seen on the face of the earth. And you are making some calls now that involve your prognostication that we're heading for major trouble in the economy and in the market. And before you explain why you say that, so many people will tell you, oh, gee, how could the economy be in trouble if the stock market is going up so much, especially the FANG tech stocks? So explain how that can happen where you have a terrible economy and yet certain stocks are going up tremendously.
Well, yeah, and I get in, a lot of trouble with some of my readers because of the fact I say it's a terrible economy, and if they're Trump supporters, they want to believe that America is being made great again. And when Obama was in office, I spent all those years ridiculing different things the Obama administration did, and now I ridicule things the Trump administration is doing because they're just as bad. And so my statement before Donald Trump even created his huge tax giveaway to corporations was that none of that was going to trickle down into people's pockets, and that it was not going to stimulate the economy at all. It was going to stimulate entirely the stock market. So that's where the two separate, is he created these tax breaks, and it did not stimulate the economy at all. It is a fact, whether people want to accept it or not, that the last 3 quarters of the Trump administration averaged no better than the last part of the Obama administration. It did not boost the economy a bit. We've had since 2018, we've had these tax cuts, and Trump's average was right around 2.0 GDP growth and falling. So his average was in decline, which was what I said we were going to see last year as we start slipping towards this gradual move into a recession. And so it did not create economic growth. The economy was stagnant in spite of these massive tax cuts. So what happened with all the money that's being saved? Well, it went back into buying stocks. And this is where the whole trickle-down theory is complete nonsense if you think it through. It's self-defeating. The idea is, well, if we give people a big break on their capital gains taxes, or like he just did, to basically it helps stockholders again, that they're going to invest it into building factories and creating jobs, because these are the job creators. Well, guess what? If you're an entrepreneur, you don't benefit from a capital gains tax cut. You're taking money and you're building out a company, and the only way you make a profit is the hard way, by building things and providing services and eventually making a profit, and then you pay normal income tax on your profits. That's not capital gains. Capital gains, you go out, you buy a stock, you turn it over, you make money off of it, and then you get taxed on that. So where are you going to put your money if you got a lot of money? Are you going to go through all that trouble to build new factories and employ people and fight all the legal battles you have to, and maybe someday make a profit and then pay higher taxes because you pay normal income taxes on that money? Or are you just going to put it into stocks where in the end you make the money real easy in a year and you pay lower taxes? So that's where I say it's self-defeating. You're not going to put the money into building new factories. You're going to put it into stocks and artwork and football teams, things that you can turn over and make capital gains profit on, because you can do that faster, and in the end you get taxed less.
Well, should this shutdown that the governments have imposed, should that have been able to create the economic disaster that it's created if we were in a healthy economy?
It's hard to say, because let's face it, we've never shut down the global economy where every nation on earth did this kind of a shutdown in one form or another together. And then to face what we're going to have and trying to restart that is something we've never experienced. So you can't really say, well, how would it have been if the economy were stronger? For sure. But without a doubt, we were in an economy that, for all the huge deficit that we created with these tax cuts and with the spending increases that the government did, we were seeing zero increase in the growth. So we'd reached a point of diminishing returns on all these tax cuts where we were getting no bang for the buck out of them at all. And that means, what do you do when you do have to stimulate your economy? You're already stimulating it with huge tax cuts. The Federal Reserve was already pumping in trillions of dollars all over again. So when something like this does hit, if those things haven't been stimulating the economy for months, how are they going to help pull it out when you really have a problem? So I think it has to be worse. But
yeah. Now, what are the metrics you're looking at now in terms of what kind of a situation we're walking into?
In terms of the economy, or in terms of the stock market?
Both.
Okay. Well, in terms of the economy, and that's really more my interest than stocks. If you wind up talking about the overall economy, you're going to wind up talking about stocks. So I wind up getting into that. But in terms of the economy, like I said, it's more my interest. You don't have any capacity to pull us out of this, really, like I was kind of leading towards. You've already been creating massive debts. You've already done massive tax cuts. They already weren't doing anything. Those are the things you usually do to try to put your foot on the accelerator and accelerate yourself out. As David Stockman says, the Fed's all out of dry powder. It's done these things until the law of diminishing returns kicks in, and now it takes so much of it to do it that we have a problem with it starting to affect the U.S. credit rating. We got a little chip off the U.S. credit rating like we did back in, I think it was 2011, because the debt's going up so fast, the credit rating agencies are pulling that down. And I don't know how fast that's going to come down, but we're at a point where it's getting dangerous to keep piling up the debt as fast as we're doing now, and there's no end in sight to it. So we're not going to stimulate our way out of the economy. And my point all along has been that the economy from the shutdown is going to break far worse than what people are willing to realize. You hear all this talk about the V-shaped recovery. And I said, there's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It's going to look like it at first. And that's going to convince everybody that's talking about the V-shaped recovery that, hey, see, we're right. We told you. Well, no, when you shut everything off with circuit breakers, you can turn the circuit breakers back on and a whole lot of stuff suddenly comes up and it looks real V-shaped because it shoots right up. But the question is how much stuff doesn't shoot up? And you only get to find that out a couple of months later when you find out how much stuff didn't recover. And so what I said is you're going to find that this V-shaped recovery narrative fuels a huge stock market boost because people believe in it. And so they're going to start betting ahead of times that, hey, profits are going to come up and these companies are going to be worth more money. And so the stock market's going to run up. But it's all baloney because in a couple of months, it's going to start to become obvious. Look at all the restaurants that didn't open. Look at all the businesses that didn't reopen because they got shot through the heart and they're dead and they're not ever coming back. And those jobs aren't coming back. And I said, at that point, we're going to start to see that about mid-July. And it'll be obvious at that point where the jobs are leveling off, how many we got back and how many we don't. And now we're kind of at this equilibrium, right? Where we see that the number of new jobs coming on is about equal to the number of jobs being lost. And we're at this high unemployment that's now pretty much just plateauing. It's not coming down anymore. And the stock market, I said, would probably wake up to that in late August or September. And then things would start to get real with the stock market and things would start to get ugly.
What did you think of the NFP, non-farm payrolls employment report on Friday?
Yeah, I'm going to write an article on that because that was so bogus. I refer to the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps these statistics, and I call them all the time, it's the BLS. I call it the Bureau of Lying Statistics because of how they manipulate the numbers. And this was the worst I've ever seen, where usually their manipulations make the numbers look better for the government, but because of the way the COVID crisis kind of intervened, their adjustments were actually making things, they said, look a little worse. So they had to tweak the numbers, they said, tweak the way they make their adjustments so that things would look better like they really are. And so they adjusted it, and lo and behold, it improved things by like 250,000 jobs, and everybody got all excited and said, whoa, 250,000 better than we were the month before. This is great. It was all about the adjustments. And then the fact that the government also hired 250,000 census workers, so that helped. But that's going to be a 1 month one-off, and then we're going to watch and see how the rest of the months don't get any better. I have pointed out in the past how the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2 years in a row, 1 year we had a December that was unusually cold, and they said, well, we have to do a seasonal adjustment because it's unusually cold, and they adjusted the job numbers so they looked better, on the basis that because it was unusually cold, construction and stuff like that was, slowed way down. And so jobs were what they would have been. Well, regardless, number one, jobs were what they were. So who cares if that's the reason? Jobs were down. So why color it and put the job number up? Because it's unseasonably cold. And it's winter. It's always unseasonable. It's always cold in winter. What's unseasonable about it? Why do you have to adjust the numbers for cold? And to prove how bogus that was, because that it was such a huge adjustment, like 250,000 jobs, and I'm like, come on, And the very next winter, they adjusted the jobs up because it was unseasonably cold by 250,000. The very next winter, they adjusted the jobs up again by about 250,000 because it was unseasonably warm. It was an unseasonably warm winter. Now, you'd think that would mean construction would boom, right? If that was the problem, and that would offset any other problems. But no, because it was unseasonably warm, nobody was going in to buy fur coats at Macy's, et cetera. And so there wasn't as much holiday hiring because people weren't out shopping. They didn't need all those winter clothes. Well, gee, wouldn't you think the construction boom would have more than offset that? you know? So apparently there's only one temperature, which is 72 degrees with a nice breeze that makes for real job numbers, and anything else you have to adjust.
So they can only do the adjustments in San Diego.
Yeah, that's the only place doesn't have to adjust. Temperature's always just right. Jobs are fine. But New York, yeah, it's 1 year too cold, too hot. It's like, come on.
I was mind boggled when I saw the number, and we're adding close to 1 million new unemployment claims every week. And
Yeah,
they said jobs went up by over, I think, 1.4 million. How does that happen when there's 1 million jobs a week being lost?
yeah. Well, the point four part was the 250,000 that they got from the adjustment and the 250,000 they got from adding census workers, which is a one-off that'll eventually be, a 250,000 going the other way when the census is done. So, and the 1 million, you can look at it this way. There's maybe 1 million jobs coming on, new, being created while 1 million jobs are being lost. That's a wash. You're not making any headway because, there was 1 million more left their jobs as well. So,
Now you're making a prediction in your latest article. I think it's called something about the bear cage being rattled.
uh-huh. Yeah,
I believe that's the title. Stock market's caged bear about to rattle himself loose. That's the name of the article,
right,
which they could find on the Great Recession blog.
right.
Tell us about that article and what you're seeing and what you're predicting.
Well, I had been gathering a lot of stock market indicators, both to show how just ridiculously overpriced the stock market was, and also signs that it's starting to break down internally and getting ready to flip. And I was not at all surprised to see those statistics starting to show up, because remember, I had said that we're going to see this huge boost from the reopening, and then it's going to start to get real when we start to see how far reopening didn't go. And it's going to get more real when we start losing those programs the government's doing that's keeping us from feeling the pain, such as the forbearance laws and things like that. When those start falling off and the extra money going in your pocket from the unemployment bonuses starts falling off, you're going to start feeling the pain of all this, and the stocks are going to go down. So I was watching all these various indicators to see if the stock market was going to turn when I thought it would. And I wrote the article, and I was gathering these things, and I felt really compelled. I got a lot of them, and I just need to get this thing out and burn the midnight oil, because it's getting so close to breaking. I think it's going to break before I get the news out, get the warning out if I don't. So I burned the midnight oil for a couple of days and pulled together probably my longest article, because I felt I really had a lot of denial to crack through, because people really believe this market's going to go up. So I just put out graph after graph, statistic after statistic, showing all the signs that the market was overpriced and that it was starting to break down seriously internally and was likely to flip. And I got that out. And of course, 2 days after I published the article, the stock market took a major nosedive. And then the day after that, it went down some more. Who knows? Like, it's too early for a victory lap, if you want to call it that, of saying, yeah, I called it and it happened right when I said it was going to, because it could all change tomorrow. But I think it's at that breaking point that I was talking about. And that's what this big jump down was, is a little aha, get real moment about how the recovery did not happen. And it may have its ups and downs, but I think it's going to have a real rocky road ahead of it. Probably won't fall off as it might fall off as fast as it did back in March, but it's more likely to be a series of cascades down as it keeps trying to rebuild and strengthen. Just lots of bad news keeps pushing it down.
Tell us about some of the graphs which exemplify the statistics you're looking at.
Okay. Yeah, and I wish I had a way to pull the graphs up here, but I'm not sure how to do that. So I'll just kind of go through my article somewhat in its order and skip through a few
Does
of
that
them.
help you?
Let's see here. I just switched to the article.
It's page 8.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. The one I was gonna go to is the Buffett indicator.
Oh, okay.
Do you happen to have that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
What page? You remember what page that was on?
Let's see here. No, I don't, because on mine it all comes up as one page, but it's a big red line graph that goes up to the right. Um,
Yeah, I'm
let's just start in the order that you've got there. You got the let's
well.
see.
The first thing I've got is the S&P to the sales ratio.
Okay.
Can you see that?
Okay, right. Okay, I found it on my article here too. Um, so yeah, I like to compare the S&P. It's price. You know, everybody talks about price to earnings ratios, and I'm talking about price to sales ratios. Um, when I talk about the S&P, because earnings are so manipulated. They've been manipulated by stock buybacks, which make them look better than they are. But sales, you can't really manipulate. They are what they are. And so the graph shows that, you know, the S&P to its sales um, is highly overpriced. Now, what you've got there is actually the forward multiplier. I was talking about the price to sales, but there you do have a PE graph, and it shows that that's highly overpriced too. So I talk about it in both terms, in terms of the price of the stocks to the sales that the company is experiencing and the price to its forward multiple of earnings. And you can see that both of those graphs, if you look at the article, are at the levels they were at when the market broke down so badly back in the dot-com bust.
Explain the Buffett indicator. I don't have the chart, but it's pretty easy to
Yeah.
explain.
So that one is if it goes above 100%, Warren Buffett says it's not a good time to be buying stocks. Stocks are generally too overpriced. And what he's talking about is if you look at the full value of the stock market and you compare that to the gross domestic product, 100% is when the total value of all the companies on the stock in the Wilshire 500 is equal to the gross domestic product. And anytime it gets above 100%, he looks at that as being not the best time for buying stocks because they're getting overpriced. They're valued more than what the economy itself is valued. Well, now it's up to 200%. So it's the highest that it's ever been. And so that was one indicator that of how overpriced the market was, how insane it was. It's never even been close to this high. Another one of the graphs that I came to, let's see, I'm going to skip past the PE multiple that we just talked about. And if you look at the NASDAQ relative to the S&P 500, because the NASDAQ has been shooting out way over the top of everything else because it's got all the high-tech stocks in it, or most of them. And it's only the top 6 high-tech stocks that are carrying the market up. The rest of the market is collapsing. And if you look at the NASDAQ as compared to the S&P, the only time it was ever this high was during the dot-com bust, the ratio between those two of how much the NASDAQ was overreaching the rest of the market. And now it's even higher than it was in 2000 when we had the dot-com bust. So it's even more overreaching. If you
Also,
look,
you have the PE ratios on these high flying tech stocks. And if you notice,
right, look at those, and you got, you know, it's 977 times earning for Tesla and 126 for Amazon, et cetera. And if you look at like Apple, for example, its total value versus the rest of the Russell 2000, you get 98% of all the stocks on Russell 2000 add up to the value of Apple. Basically, it's almost equal to the 2,000 companies that are in the Russell 2000. That's how overpriced that number is.
and normal would be 13 to 17 PE ratio.
Yeah, right. And so you look at those at hundreds of times normal, and then people saying, well, but it's justified. because the economy is going to reopen. It wasn't justified before the economy collapsed with COVID. So how on earth is it justified on the basis that, well, you know, the economy is going to reopen and things will get better? Well, if they got 100% better, those numbers would still be totally out of whack, totally insane.
I remember back in the around 2000, I had a friend named Chris who was a stockbroker. And at that time, I wouldn't know a PE from a batting average. But I did notice that none of these companies were making money. And I kept saying to him, well, how can these companies, the stocks, be going up like this when they don't have any real earnings? And people would always say to me, you're not with it. You're in the past. It's the potential earnings in the future that's driving these stocks. And of course, for a while that worked.
Yeah, but it, you know, it's so obviously a fantasy when you're talking about how are potential earnings 5 years from now going to justify those kinds of multiples. You know, if the economy had boomed under Trump and had doubled in size, I don't think you could justify those kinds of forward multiples. But instead, the economy is tanked, and you know, and you blame it on the COVID crisis if you want, or say it was already going there. Either way, it's tanked, and so there's no justification for it at all. And sooner or later, that bubble has to pop. And I've said it's going to get real starting in, you know, late August or September, and it's going to be a real rough ride from that point forward.
And sure enough, in September, we had a 1,000-point decline. We don't know yet whether this is the big one or whether it's just a big correction, but we're going to find out. And what is your prediction for October?
Well, first starting with September, I would say that September is the weakest month for stocks. And then looking at October, October seems to be, and I'm not exactly sure why, the month when the biggest crashes like to happen. So there's something about October that loves a surprise, and September is just the weakest month for stocks anyway. So you're talking about these problems with the economy not reopening, materializing and becoming obvious at the same time when the market usually has its rough period anyway. So that's not a good confluence. And that's all the more reason why, you know, I think the market is really at high risk of falling now, besides being extraordinarily overpriced. It's entering its weak time. The whole COVID crash, reopening failure is ganging up on it at the same time. And then we're going into, you know, probably the ugliest election season we've ever seen. So there's just a world of chaos out there. And I don't believe the stock market's going to survive it. It's completely unjustified in being where it is from any kind of business metric. It's pure wild speculation in a casino. And people say, well, the federal, and I think this is the big thing to throw in here, rather than talking a lot about graphs that, you know, people can't see without going to the article anyway, is the big belief is you can't fight the Fed, and that the Federal Reserve has this, and they're creating all this money, and so the stocks are going to keep going up. They'll weather through because it doesn't matter what businesses are doing. Well, there's a couple ways of looking at that. One is, if that's true, then ultimately the Fed is also creating a lot of zombie companies by creating, you know, all this cheap debt that they pile on to survive, but they're not doing any business. Their business isn't improving because of the debt. Their business has gotten worse because of the COVID-19 shutdown. And so they're zombies. They only can service this debt because it's so cheaply priced, and that forces the Fed to keep at this low price debt basically forever so they can keep recycling that. So you're going to have zombie, you know, one way to look at it is you're going to have zombie companies that are trading as trillion-dollar chips in the stock market in that case, because they're bankrupt, because they don't have any business, but they still exist in name, and they're still on the charts, so they can still be traded. So they're going to be trillion-dollar companies that have no business if it's true that it doesn't matter what the economy's doing because the Fed's pumping it up. Well, fine, let the Fed keep pumping prices up. The economy will keep making them less and less profitable, and until they're just shell corporations trading, you know, at a $1 trillion market cap. So
I was watching a peak prosperity video with this fella, Adam Taggart, and he was interviewing two guys from a company called New Harbor Financial. Pretty good guys. One guy, his name is Mike Preston, and his partner, I think his name is John, I forget his last name. He basically made the point that the fair value of the S&P is roughly 12 to 1300. And think about how far down that is.
Yeah.
The bottom of the channel is only 2100.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're at the top of the channel. So
Right.
if it went back down to the bottom of the channel, which is normal, it still would be way overvalued. And that's a scary thought. And I don't know if you get into these type of predictions, but it seems to me that if they cannot keep the stock market propped up, Joe Biden is actually going to win the election, even though he may be completely senile, as far as I can tell. Mm-hmm. And yet he will win because he's running against Juan Perón, basically, from Argentina. And it's a frightening thought to me. And I don't know if you get into political predicting, but it's a frightening thought that these two characters on both sides are the best that America has to offer. That to me is frightening.
That's what's frightening to me too. I definitely don't get into political predictions. I have no idea where this is going to go or who's going to win it. And I don't even know which is going to be worse for the stock market if they do win. But it is scary to me that this is really the best and the brightest America has to offer. I mean, even though I like some of the things that Trump is behind and would support, not all of them for sure, like some of the stuff we're talking about, but there are some things I do like, but he's such a horrible spokesperson for those things because in my view, he's so divisive that he stirs up all of this rage rather than building an argument for why we should do it, trying to get people to understand, okay, there's some sense for why we would change our immigration policy and building support. He does it in ways that create a lot of hostility and a lot of division. I'm not against what his goal is for slowing down immigration and controlling it better, but the way he goes about it just creates a huge amount of animosity because he thrives on chaos. He loves to be provocative. He knows that if he says things in the most provocative way, the press will carry it. And he knows how to play the press. But what's good for him getting press isn't good for the rest of the nation. It's not what we need in a president. If you're going to try to implement those policies that are a hard pill for people to swallow that want more immigration, you need to build your case publicly for it and consolidate opinion around it and not just create all these divisions. That's my feeling. So
yeah, I certainly concur in that opinion. That's one thing Ronald Reagan had.
Yes,
he'd go on television and use the bully pulpit, and he would show the charts to the American people, and then he would explain it. And I remember when he carried all the federal regulations up to the podium, and he could barely lift it. It was so heavy, and he used that as a prop. Those were very clever ways to explain concepts in as simple a manner as possible. The problem with Reagan, though, is he campaigned on an anti-globalist platform, just like Trump did. And then he went and appointed all globalists to his cabinet. And Trump, of course, he campaigns on draining the swamp.
And then he builds the White House with swamp creatures.
Yeah. Steve Mnuchin from Goldman Sachs, guys who go to Bilderberger meetings like Mike Pompeo, guys who are involved heavily in globalist organizations and draining the swamp, and that's anti-globalist. So it's kind of like worldwide wrestling. You have the one fake wrestler on one side and the other fake wrestler on the other side. And the American people are the suckers who are cheering and booing for their favorite guy and actually begin to believe that it's real.
Yeah, and they spend, they get so caught up in supporting their champion that they don't even care that the ideas that he said he was going to bring about aren't happening. So you look at, is America great? America has never looked worse. The economy has never been more in shatters in my lifetime. The stock market already crashed once this year, and it's going to crash again. And like you say, the bottom could be a whole lot farther down, and I believe it is a lot farther down. Is this a great America? We've got the worst COVID spreading of any part of the world. I just looked at a map today, and America is practically glowing in bright colors, and other parts aren't as bad. I don't know, exactly what the right approach is to that, but we're not doing any stellar job, that's for sure. I don't know. America doesn't look great to me. It's never been more hostile. Cities have never been a bigger mess. And I'm not saying all of that is Trump's fault, but America was not made great. So now he's campaigning on keep America great. Well, we never got there.
Yeah. Well, what would you recommend? I know you're not a financial advisor, but in very general terms, how would you advise people generically to protect themselves?
It's kind of, there's the standard gold thing. I have a hard time doing gold because it's like, if you're going to buy gold, you got to transport the gold, or you got to trust the people that are going to store the gold. Are you going to insure the shipments of it? What kind of a price can you really get when you want to sell it, because others don't know the quality of your gold without us saying it? I just find it all problematic. But I guess if you've got all that figured out, and maybe you do, and you've spent time thinking about it and have systems you trust, you can do that. For me, I've just parked our money in cash for right now. So the biggest risk is going to be in stocks and bonds. It's not the cash of things that are available in 401ks are necessarily safe either. I just think they're probably going to be the last to fall, and by then I'll figure out what else to move it to, and maybe I'll go ahead and cave in and buy gold or something. But
well, there's an old saying, you can't. Well, I've been somebody who I don't call it investing in gold. I call it just having some real value that can't be printed and can't be put on a digital screen somewhere. We don't have a lot of good choices, as is evident. But the one thing I do know is believing the government is never a very good choice. And as government gets more and more powerful, there's an old saying that any government big enough to give you everything is big enough to take everything away. And I think that for the middle class, that is the future. They're going to be wiped out. Their wages will not be able to maintain the standard of living. And by the way, that's why in the old days, I know I'm a dinosaur, but in the old days, the unions used to be in favor of the gold standard. Mm-hmm. They felt it was the only way to protect the wages of their workers and the buying power of their workers. Of course, now the unions have hoarded themselves, just like the politicians and just like the corporate executives have basically sold out the working people of this country in favor of running a protection racket with the government. And that's what we have today. We have socialism or crony capitalism, and all these people that say this is a free market economy. Anytime you hear Jerome Powell of the Fed talking about he's going to control this, and he knows the right price for this, and he knows what the right inflation is, and we should have 2.5% average inflation. I mean, after all, 2.5% times 35, that's a lot of inflation over time. So even those cockamamie numbers, it's not very positive. So why don't you just close up here with telling our viewers how they can get your material, how they can subscribe to it, how they can support your material, and educate themselves, because if they don't become autodidacts and educate themselves, they're not going to get any education.
Yeah, well, the blog is thegreatrecession.info, so it's easy to find. And once you get to it, there are subscriber buttons, and I could certainly use the subscriber support because, as you can imagine, the mainstream media doesn't carry this kind of stuff. In fact, you and I were just talking about how they've shut down certain things that you'd become aware of, and how it happened with me. I was writing for a website where, COVID-19, we were told you can't write about that anymore. You have to be part of MSN, or you have to be part of one of the big sites to do that. And this was Google that said that, we're bringing down your ratings if you're not a mainstream media site that's carrying this stuff, because, we don't trust your truthworthiness on covering COVID-19. So I had been writing on that, and it explained why some of my articles on that site had lousy ratings, was because they were automatically getting shut out by Google.
Yeah. Well, I do trust your writings, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. And I continue to read every single word that you write. And sometimes, like on this last article, it's quite a few pages, and I read them anyway because I'm obsessed with knowledge, and it's kind of a healthy addiction.
Well, and that was certainly my longest article, but it was because I felt like there's just so much denial into the market that if I don't lay out graph after graph after graph showing why there are reasons to believe this thing is going to come down, there's nobody out there wants to believe it. So I got to build a tough case. So it's a long article because I had a tough case to build.
So the people who are buying the propaganda need to go to greatrecession.info and read the article, Stock Market's Cage Bear, about to rattle himself loose. And David, once again, a pleasure to have you. I'm sure I'll be chatting with you in the future.
All right. Thanks, Bob. I've been enjoying your interviews of other people.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. We'll see you.
You too.